Hello and good morning, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are across the world. We have several hundred people joining us today across a dozen or so time zones. So wherever you are and whenever it is, wherever you live, you're welcome. Now today's PETinar is particularly about single-use plastic. It's an issue that is being pushed up the agenda, is becoming more and more important. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, directives in the European Union are likely to affect your business either directly or because they influence other legislation elsewhere in the world, whether it be in Japan, United States, South America, wherever it may be. Now, before I actually introduce our speaker, I'd like to address some housekeeping points. If you give me a moment. There will be time for questions at the end. You can pose them by using the dialog box at the bottom right of your screen. Questions will be moderated. We shan't be passing on hellos and greetings to the rest of the world. We'll take it as read that you're glad to be here, and so is everybody else. Now, questions will be posed at the end of the presentation, which will take 20 to 30 minutes. We'll have plenty of time, so feel free to take up any points arising, and also feel free to pose them during the presentation as we go along. They will be moderated, they'll be brought up at the end. Our speaker today is Dr. Rana Pant from the European Commission. He hasn't always been at the European Commission. He's worked with an international consumer goods company on topics related to integrated waste management and life cycle assessment. So he knows what he's talking about in experience as well as theoretically. He is an environmental engineer by training from the Technical University of Berlin with a focus on solid waste management. He holds a PhD in engineering from the Darmstadt University of Technology with a thesis in the area of life cycle assessment in design for environment. I'll hand over to Dr. Rana and catch up with you again at the end.
Yes, thanks very much and welcome everybody from me as well. Thanks for providing me with the opportunity. I tried to go through the presentation which I have prepared rather fast to leave enough time for question and answers. I hope you can see the presentation now. It's a different system than we are using normally at the Commission, so I hope it will work. So I will talk about the Single-Use Plastics Directive, EU 2019/904, and I will mainly give a brief background on the SUPD directive. Why do we have it in the first place? Then what are the main provisions of the directive, and a little bit on the implementation status. Just for the background, we all have seen the regrettable pictures of, let's say, littered beaches and animals, mammals and others who have ingested plastics and basically as a result of that were harmed or even died. We have as well health concerns, so also human beings may be affected by it. We have an impact on fisheries and aquaculture, and of course, if it gets too bad, then tourism in coastal communities is affected by it as well. And that's basically the background for the directive, which I think we have to keep in mind. It's in the context of the whole circular economy and the EU plastic strategy. One of the ideas of the EU plastic strategy is really to curb plastic waste and littering, and that is where the Single-Use Plastics Directive comes into play. It addresses the most found marine litter items on European beaches by count, so it's not a weight-related measure, but all the, let's say, the beach counts, which are often done together or in connection by NGOs. Relate to items, and if you look at it, basically you can see that single-use plastic products make up roughly 50%. Then you have fishing related items 27%, other plastics 7%, and non-plastics roughly 16%. So it's of course not all plastics, but plastics has a pretty high share. If you then look into these 50% of single-use plastic product items, you figure out that, well, actually, while there's a plethora of items lying around on beaches, 10 items make up 86% of those 50%, and there remain only 14%. The Single-Use Plastics Directive made that basically a feature of itself and says we want to target the 10 most found items on the beach, which then will cover 43%, and fishing gear. And with that together, you cover actually roughly 70% of marine litter found on European beaches. And that's actually not bad. What are the topics, the items we are talking about? So what is found most, and well, for the audience, probably pretty relevant is ranking item number 1 is drinks, bottles, caps, and lids. And probably others are less relevant, at least for PET as a material. Of course, you have drinks, cups and lids, and you have food containers, including fast food packaging as well as number 10. And of course, you find other things sometimes in very high number, like cigarette butts, cotton bud sticks, sanitary applications like wet wipes, cutlery and stirrers, and so on. Now, the objectives are really coming from this marine litter perspective to prevent and reduce the impact of certain plastic products on the environment, particularly on the marine environment and human health, but as well, and that is sometimes overlooked, to promote the transition to a circular economy with innovative and sustainable business models, products, and materials. And as we are in an EU internal market as well, of course, we want to contribute to an efficient functioning of the internal market. What is also clear and needs to be highlighted sometimes in the discussion, this directive is not directive against plastics, but it is really tackling the unsustainable use of plastics. And I think that's an important difference to make. What are the main provisions in the directive? Different products or product groups, you can say, are basically obliged to follow different measures. And the basic principle in which the measures were designed was really looking at, are there more sustainable alternatives available right now on the market? If that is the case, as you can see in the first box, for cotton bud sticks, straws, stirrers, cutlery, plates, where there are more sustainable alternatives right away available, then you have market restrictions or market bans, basically. If there's, in the impact assessment, which has been done before the directive was basically negotiated within the EU institutions, if there were no clear items identified, no clear alternatives which would be more sustainable, and then, of course, you can't right away ban product, but you would go into prevention measures, like design requirements in Article 6, like consumption reduction measures, consumer information, but as well, what is of course relevant for the bottles is the separate collection, extended producer responsibility, litter cleanup, and of course as well the recycled content falls into that. Going through the measures basically one by one, in Article 4, you have basically the consumption reduction described, which covers food containers, cups for beverages, including covers and lids. And it's up to the member states basically to propose measures, appropriate measures that lead to a sustained and quantitative reduction in those products. It is to note, while there is a requirement to have a quantitative reduction, there is no quantitative reduction target set. The time frame by which a measurable reduction has to be achieved is 2026 with a baseline of 2022. But again, requirement is to achieve a reduction quantitatively, but no quantitative target is set. Of course, member states could do so, but it's not in the directive. And to note as well that it is related to those products, food containers and cups for beverage, including covers and lids. You have the possibility as a member state as well to go beyond what is normally allowed in the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive. So you could come up with restrictions to put things on the market if you want to prevent those products from becoming litter, and in order to ensure that they are substituted with alternatives that are reusable or are non-plastic alternatives. So that member states can do, and that would of course go beyond the Article 18 of the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, where for internal market purposes, every packaging fulfilling the essential requirements would be allowed on the market. Then we have Article 5. These covers those products which were actually in the impact assessment more sustainable and readily available alternatives have been identified. And those are banned as of July 2021. These are cotton bud sticks, cutlery, plates, straws, beverage stirrers, sticks for balloons, but not the balloons itself. All products made from oxo-degradable plastics, and cups and food and beverage containers made of expanded polystyrene. Background for that is that those showed up on the beach disproportionately high. Of course, you can argue that is a matter of the density of the products which make them float. Then we have Article 6, where I'm sure you will be interested quite a bit. It's the tethered caps and lids, where there basically is a standardization effort ongoing. The request had been accepted after a round, and it's basically work in progress. So it's simply to avoid that the caps get detached and lids get detached from bottles and get littered separately. And of course, you have in Article 6 also the binding target, again, for member states to ensure that the recycled content is achieved in single-use plastic beverage bottles which are placed on the market in their respective member state. And that would be 25% for PET bottles covered from 2025 and 30% recycled content for bottles from 2030. And that would then cover all bottles, not only PET bottles. This, to my knowledge, is the first time that a recycled content target has been put on a European level. So it's a novum, but it will probably not remain the only one. I will come to that later. Article 7 is basically related to the marking of products. There are certain products which covers tobacco filters for tobacco, but as well cups for beverages, wet wipes and sanitary towels are covered, and they have to be labeled to ensure that consumers are aware that, well, this product contains plastic, which may be obvious for some products, but less obvious for other products. It should convey the message of what you should not do with the product, for example, litter it in the environment or flush it down the toilet. And as well, it should convey the message what are the negative environmental impacts if you dispose it in an inappropriate way. Extended producer responsibility is captured in Article 8, and as well a pretty wide range of products covered here. Also food and beverage containers, bottles, cups and packets and wrappers. And it is basically polluters pay principle that charges might become to producers sorry, regarding waste management, collection and treatment costs of on-the-go waste in public areas, litter cleanup and data gathering. And for wet wipes and balloons, the provisions are a little bit different because they are not under the normal waste management, solid waste management structure sometimes. Sorry. Sorry for that. Then Article 9 describes the separate collection of the plastic beverage bottles with targets from 2025, 77% and 2029, 90%, which can be achieved either via, for example, existing EPR schemes, separate collection schemes, or through really deposit refund schemes. But there the directive is very clear that the member states can decide on how they best achieve those targets. The targets are set as a framework and the member states decide how to implement it and how to achieve them. Of course, the idea in the background is to support high quality recyclates and uptake of secondary materials, so to provide enough material that is available, and indirectly, while not stated necessarily and directly linked, it of course supports as well the enlarged and heightened plastic packaging recycling target in the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive by 2030. Article 10 is that in general, it's well understood that littering has as well as a lot to do with the products, but as well with those who litter the products. And that is why awareness raising and information to consumers is big as well there, as one of the measures to inform consumers on availability, for example, of reusable alternatives, of reuse systems, and different waste management options, to inform consumers on the impact of littering, and actually on the impact on sewer networks for products which we find could be inappropriately flushed down the toilet as a means of disposal. And of course, all of this is really there to achieve the reduction of littering of single-use plastic products. In 2027, I will not go in detail into that slide. There's a revision of the directive, which has the objective to review whether it actually worked and achieved its really objectives, whether something needs to be changed on the scope of the directive, on the products covered, looking into biodegradability, whether there has been progress. So some things are written in there. On the implementation side, what we have is that most provisions are to be implemented and transposed into member state legislation by July 3 this year. However, there are a few exemptions, so market restrictions are from July 21, so not before. The product design will kick in from July 2024, simply because the standardization process usually and very normally has to take its time and takes a few years. The marking requirements actually kick in already July this year, and EPR will be again then later with 2024. From the implementation work on the side of the commissions, we will come up, or have to come up, with two sets of guidelines. One is relatively imminent, the SUP guidelines on the products to be covered according to Article 12. Another one on criteria on cost for litter cleanup will come definitely a bit later. That is on Article 8. There's also no deadline in the directive for that. Two standardization requests, which are both ongoing. The one on tethered caps and lids, according to Article 6, so related to the plastic bottles, so pretty relevant to the audience here, and the circularity of fishing gears as well ongoing. Then there will be a range of implementing acts related to marking, to the separate collection of beverage bottles, to the reporting of fishing gear, to the reporting on the consumption reduction measures that member states take, and as well on the data reporting of the achieved consumption reduction, reporting related to tobacco filters, and of course as well reporting on the measuring and reporting of the recycled content in beverage bottles, which of course is very interesting because it's the first of its kind. How does it look like in practice? Just an example from the marking. The label, as mentioned, has to indicate the presence of plastic, wrong disposal behavior, and negative environmental impact. Regulation 2020/2151 has been released on the harmonized marking in December last year. Unfortunately, there have been a few translation errors in that version, in the translated version, and corrigenda had been released in on March 5 this year, and the pictograms to be used are basically available on our DG Environment website. Very briefly on the recycled content, of course, the Single-Use Plastics Directive, as I mentioned, is the first of its kind, but it will very likely not stay alone. There are two things ongoing. The one is, of course, the efforts, which probably many of you will be familiar with, of the Circular Plastics Alliance, which has pledged 10 million tons of recycled plastics in new products on the EU market by 2025. So that's a big chunk for sure. And the Circular Economy Action Plan 2.0 has mandated the Commission to come up with proposals for further mandatory requirements for recycled content in key product areas, such as packaging, construction materials, and vehicles. With that, I hope I have at least given a few pointers for also the discussion which is upcoming, and I'm happy to take the questions. Thank you very much.
A very informative presentation, and I made a few notes myself, and I'm sure that other people will have done as well. Now, I'm going to start asking about tethered caps, if I may. And this is a question that's come via PETplanet. So when planning and constructing these concepts, many things must be taken into account. And tethered caps must offer customers the same technical performance as conventional closures. And ideally, they should be usable without modifying bottleneck finishes and filling equipment, and without loss of efficiency in the handling and filling process. But first and foremost, the requirements of the EU directive must be met, which are set out in more detail in a CEN standard that is still being drawn up. When will there be a binding standard that manufacturers can follow? Do you know?
The way I mean, to be honest, I'm not leading the file on the tethered caps, so that's my colleague Paolo in our sister unit, but I will do as good as I can. The way the directive works is that you have a standard, and if it's accepted, then it will be a harmonized standard, and that means that you have, let's call it the presumption of conformity with the directive if you fulfill the standard. It is not that the standard itself is mandatory.
Okay.
It is basically to say you have to oblige to what is in the directive, and the way to show compliance so that you can place your product on the market is by adhering to the standard. So it's a little bit from a legal, I mean, I'm an environmental engineer, but I've been told from a legal perspective that is different than to say that the standard is mandatory. What is mandatory is, of course, the provisions in the directive. And the way to show compliance with the provisions is the fulfillment of the standard.
So the way to comply is to comply. Is that right?
Basically, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes it easier. But when we know exactly what the standard is, then we'll all be able to comply. I mean, different parts of the world are a little bit ahead of us. Australia has already pretty much nailed it, I think, in terms of tethered caps. Now, Sonia San Martin actually asked, would the tethered closures directive apply also to refillable PET bottles? And I think I can actually answer that myself. Sonia, I think you'll find it on slide 12 that the answer is indeed yes, that it applies to refillable bottles just the same as it does to single use in that particular instance. Now, I think I know the answer to this one, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. PET bottles, are they considered single-use product when the customer can use it as a refillable product? And that's from Valentin Adams.
There are three provisions to basically distinguish single-use from multi-use. It needs to be designed, conceived, and placed on the market as a multi-use product to count as a multi-use product. So just the fact that, of course, every consumer can reuse almost anything if they want to, does not make it a reusable bottle in the sense of the directive. So you really would have to place it on the market as a reusable bottle. It has to be designed as a reusable bottle, and it has to be understood and conceived as well as a reusable bottle. So usually what you say in the directive is as well, for those things you may need to have a refill system. And one pointer, of course, to reusability, if there's an existing return scheme, which brings the bottle back to the producer and then it can be filled again. So it is not as easy to say if the final consumer can use it for the same purpose, even to go to the water tap and fill it again, that does not cut it.
Right. And that's fair enough. So you can't, so manufacturers wouldn't just be able to say, yes, you can refill this bottle. They actually have to provide the ecosystem to collect the bottles and reuse them and refill them. Okay, yeah. That's fairly clear. So there's no getting around it just by sending out an advert. Okay. Yeah. Now, Martin Beasley, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, says, do you know what is the EU market? Do you know what is the EU market, the ratio of PET beverage bottles and other plastic beverage bottles applied in Article 9? I think that, Bob, do you understand that?
The exact share, I wouldn't know. I can only say from the time that the targets were put out that, to be very honest, the target of 25% recycled content for PET bottles is something which by 2025 should be relatively easily achievable. The recycled content target for 30% for all beverage bottles has been created in a way that in theory it could be possible that even with only having PET bottles with recycled content, you probably would be able to meet that target. And the background for that is, of course, that PET bottles have a very high market share on the SUP beverage bottles. I mean, most of the bottles which are not PET are HDPE and are in the milk area and a little bit in juice. But I think PET probably is a vast majority. I don't know the exact share. I would guess something around 70%.
Okay.
But it is the majority of the single-use plastic bottles covered under the directive.
Okay. Linked question. Recycled PET is more expensive than virgin PET. Many manufacturers of preforms and bottles fear cheap competition from non-EU countries that don't comply. Now, how is compliance going to be monitored so that EU companies are not put at a disadvantage?
Compliance is, as usual, it's not an EU affair, but a member states affair, and then of the competent bodies. So as the whole single-use plastics directive is directed to member states, also the, let's say, controlling, if you want, of the provisions will be on a member state level. And just to make sure it's understood, the recycled content targets, for example, are also not related per bottle. They are addressed to member states. So 25% PET recycled content means that in France, for example, France must ensure 25% of the bottles placed on the market in France are on average recycled content. That does not necessarily mean that each single bottle has to achieve 25%. However, the target, of course, is applicable to both products produced within the EU and imported products. So there's no differentiation made. So it's a question really of, if you want market surveillance and from the competent authorities to check that that overall target is achieved, but there's no difference between EU producers and producers from outside.
Okay, now that's an interesting point because we've seen in the auto industry, for example, that targets for recycled content, recyclable content, and for emissions have been met across companies by large companies, which, for the sake of it, no, I won't think of naming any, buying companies that make small cars, low emission cars, so that they can carry on making big, high emission luxury cars. So in the area of this recycled content, would it be possible, for example, for countries or for companies within countries to leave meeting the average target across the country to others? Or will legislation or will sanctions be brought against individual companies as well as countries to meet these targets?
Again, that is a question how member states will transpose the requirement. Again, the firm requirement is that on average, in each member state, what is placed on the market fulfills the mandatory recycled content targets. Right. How you do that is a different way. But we know that some member states, of course, which is, let's say, the intuitive way to do this is to say, well, if the average target is 25%, then as a member state, I say each bottle has to have 25%. Right. But again, that is not up to the EU, the Commission, or anybody else to decide, but for the member states. But it's then, of course, it is within a member state possible that some will underachieve when others overachieve, and that is guaranteed by a system. How that then will be negotiated between the stakeholders, especially those who underachieve and those who overachieve, is a question for the member states.
Right. Okay. So I think that answers Chloe's question, Chloe Kinner's question, which is what happens to member states if they don't reach collection or recycled content targets. you're saying that it's actually up to the member states themselves to impose sanctions on companies that don't do it. So yeah, it's a bit Jesuitical, isn't it? Flagellation, self-flagellation, don't you think?
No, of course we don't stop there. I mean, I don't know how many, but there are many infringement cases ongoing where the EU sees member states not living up to the requirements in not the SUP directive, because that enters into force only in July, so nobody can be in non-compliance. But for other directives like the landfill directive, there are infringement cases ongoing, and it can get expensive for member states. And of course, then member states will have to decide, well, how do I get the money that I have to pay to the EU? But it is certain that always, for almost all measures in the SUP directive, there is a part in the directive of reporting requirements for member states to the Commission.
Right.
So it is rarely just left like that. You have to do it. Good luck. Goodbye. But it is very often the case that there are very clear data reporting and quality check requirements that then have to be fulfilled to put us as a Commission again in the position to check that actually member states did what they were supposed to do and that they did it exactly successfully.
All right, that's fair enough. So manufacturers will have to actually look at their own country's legislation, and as you said, imports from outside the EU will still have to meet the standards that are set by the Single-Use Plastic Directive. So if anybody was thinking of relocating their factory to the United Kingdom, we'd be delighted to have you. But if you want to send it back to the EU, you won't get past the legislation that way. All right, okay. Martin Beasley again is asking, 30% of recycled material goes to all plastic bottles or beverage plastic bottles. I think that's, and how about milk, for example? You've already answered that, I think. Chloe Kenner again is asking, what impact will chemical recycling have on reaching targets for recycled content? Is that a question that you can answer?
No, I mean, I don't know which impact it will have. At the moment, chemical recycling is negligible in terms of tonnages. Of course, it's a family of processes, not one processes. So there are different stages, if you want, of chemical recycling. If you basically have a solvulus or hydrolysis, if you go back really fully back to the monomers and put them back in a steam cracker. So there are different versions of chemical recycling, but all of them at the moment on the market are not relevant in terms of market share, what could be relevant. But of course, looking at at least the 30% target is for 2030, that can change. And we have at the moment a contract running, a support contract running, to look into the calculation measures for recycled content, because it's a novum. We have to make up our mind what counts and what doesn't count. And next to questions like, does only pre-consumer waste count, or also post-consumer waste, or the other way around? Also the way chemical recycling could or could not contribute to those targets will be looked at. And one thing we need to carefully look at, usually, of course, Commission policy framework tends to be technology neutral. So we do not prescribe how you get the recycled content. However, what is relevant in that context is, of course, a question of compliance with the Waste Framework Directive, and especially the point that, well, recycled can obviously be only something which is recycled and is basically not recovered. And the differentiation which has to be made in the case of chemical recycling is how much of the plastic waste going into the processes actually is used on the way for energy purposes. How do you deal with that? Because it does not end up as a product. And the second point needs to be looked at is, if I have a multi-output process, which usually is the case for chemical recycling, or can be the case for especially pyrolysis, gasification, then you need to look at the range of outputs which would qualify as products, because the Waste Framework Directive as well specifies that recycling is not counted if you recycle your product into a fuel-related product. So if the product as an outcome of a chemical recycling product is a fuel product, it would not count towards recycling or recycled content because it doesn't meet the recycling criteria of the Waste Framework Directive. And how to maneuver along those very complex multi-input, multi-output processes with a so-called mass balance approach will have to be looked at carefully to ensure that the provisions of the Waste Framework Directive are really obliged to as well and complied with.
Okay, that's interesting because we're differentiating here between reuse or recovery, reuse, so that's refilling a bottle that is designed to be refilled.
That is
recycling, which is taking the bottle and redoing it, remanufacturing it, and well, what we've called in also downcycling, which is taking a bottle, turning it into a fleece, turning it into to noise, vibration, harshness, insulation, and then ultimately, I don't know, going to waste burning, whatever. So we differentiate between those.
Yes, whereas of course you can argue that chemical recycling is not to be seen as a downcycling, because at least for the majority of the processes which you have, you can actually achieve, if you have a real product, the quality of virgin material, and by that instance, basically an automatic qualification as food contact material, which provides you with a high or the highest possible quality which you can have, which you may not achieve with all mechanical recycling. So chemical recycling does not automatically mean it's lower down in the hierarchy, and by that it is downcycling. It is a question what can count as recycling and recycled and what not. But the result of a chemical recycling, one of the at least advantages we can see as a complement to mechanical recycling, is that you actually can achieve food quality grades almost per definition.
Okay. Topically, Christian_1 says, where will the recycled material food approval come from? There is a significant shortage, or approved material, recycled material. There is a significant shortage in the market for PE and PP, or the material is 5 times more expensive, which we know about. Fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG, will face a rise in price by default through having to incorporate recycled element, or will there be support from the EU to lever the recycling costs? It says quote, but I think you mean cost, Christian.
I think support from the EU will for sure be given in terms of research projects or live projects in that area, where as well I know a few applications are there which are relevant in that area, because recycled content is relatively, let's say, new to come to at least to scale. I cannot see other means of support for that. But of course we do support in general as well as member states in the recycling infrastructure. So I mean, let's put it that way: the use of recycled material of the products in the input of a production, of course, is very closely linked to the end of life of the previous stuff. So what of course we try to do, and one example for it is in the SUPD directive, where we have set, let's say, relatively high targets for the separate collection for recycling of beverage bottles. So of course you can see throughout the value chain, there's a link between a high quality collection, high quality sorting, high quality recycling, and then as a final step, well, you have a high quality recycled input back into your value chain processes. And of course, you need to look at the whole value chain to see that what we need is basically a high quality approach throughout the entire value chain, starting with the collecting of the waste, the sorting and recycling. And that is something which is, of course, in the mind of the Commission as well, that it's not a punctual thing, recycled content, but you have to look at the whole chain.
Okay, that's fair enough. Now, we've got a couple that are linked, and I think we've already addressed, but it's from Ronnie van Regenmortel and from Audrey. Ronnie is saying refillable is not single use, and I think we're agreed. that is the case. Refillable is not single-use plastic. Audrey is asking, what are the reusable criteria? I think we've covered that. Yeah. I'll just mention as I go by. Right. Will slides and recording be available after the webinar? And the answer to that question is yes. Now, Neil or Nellie Stevens says, this is relating to tethering. If standardization work is not finalized in time, is it possible that the date of entering the law for tethering closures is postponed? Do we need a harmonized standard to make the directive work? I think that the answer to the first part is no. We've got a schedule for tethering, and that's there, and that's going to happen. The only way it may move is perhaps to come forward a little bit, I would have thought. But the second part, do we need a harmonized standard to make that directive work?
To be honest, I know discussions which have happened in the process of giving the mandate to SEN. I'm not 100% sure on the conclusion. There was a discussion on whether it actually was phrased correctly in the directive to enable a harmonized standard. I think our legal service had some comments. So to be honest, as an environmental engineer, I stay away from that interpretation. Let's put it that way. The way it normally works, like also in the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive with the essential requirements, is you put the requirements in the directive. You have a standardization request, you have a standard produced, then the Commission looks at it and accepts or not accepts the standard, and when it is accepted, it will be accepted as a harmonized standard with a presumption of conformity.
Yeah, okay.
That was the idea. Whether actually legally that is precisely what is written in the directive, I would need to get back to a lawyer in our team, to be honest.
Right, okay. I mean, I think as far as the tethered caps thing goes, we had a webinar last year looking at this with contributions from around the world, including from Australia, where they've been pushing along quite quickly. Sorry, my hand's very big. Yeah, the fact that no hard and fast standard has been laid down, it's just said it has to be able to withstand this sort of pressure, this sort of tearing pressure, so that it will remain tethered. And it's been left to the manufacturers to sort it out, just to make sure that they comply to the required standard. So yeah, it isn't prescribed as such, it's left to you. You know what the standards are, you have to meet them however you deem it fit. Okay, Super Banguera is saying, why did policy not consider giving different markings for multi-layered products, as they are difficult to be identified currently? It's just appearing.
Not sure I understand the question.
Okay, can you identify separately, or is it possible to mark products so that multi-layered and single-layer mono or multiple polymers can be differentiated? This is one of the challenges with recycling, of course, that you have different types of plastic.
Yes, of course. I mean, the question of marking to ease, let's say, sorting and recycling, and to make it at least more effective. Efficiency is another question. Is of course in our minds as well, but it is not part of the Single-Use Plastics Directive to go down the way to have like a mandatory requirement for marking in a specific way, like Holy Grail 2 or digital watermarking in general. So it is really, that is not included in the directive itself, but of course it is a very interesting development which the Commission is following with interest, because it could provide the opportunity to really distinguish between, not even between the polymers only, which of course is important, but also having, let's say, the legacy of the product included. Which again is very important for the food contact material applications, that you know if a product has been used as a food contact material or not. I mean, PET maybe not that often used for non-food contact materials, but it can be used, and HDPE for sure is used to a lot of extent as well, not necessarily in food contact materials. And also that information you could convey in a digital watermarking. So it's a very interesting topic, but it is not what is in the directive.
Okay, all right. Rajesh Sharma is asking, will the timelines and implementation dates for the SUP directives be revised in the light of the global crisis of the COVID pandemic? I think I know the answer to that, but I'll let you tell him.
We had that question often and thought about it and looked about the let's say the merit of the question to say, well, it is, for example, a lot of single-use plastic products are used, of course, in the HoReCa sector with a lot of food being taken out because you simply can't sit in a restaurant, unfortunately, these days. So is it a good time to kind of put obligations on this market? But we feel that it is possible to have basically safe and hygienic materials, and at the same time try to make a shift from single use to multiple use, which is one of the objectives of the directive. So for that reason, on a very generic frame, it was not taken as a point that we have to delay all the transposition of the single-use plastics directive.
Okay. Now, Joao Chambel Leitao, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, asks, does this mean that the target is only imposed on the member states? But I think we answered that one. The legislation applies within Europe, and it applies to manufacturers within Europe, and it applies to imports as well. So they all have to meet the same standard. So thanks for that, Yao. And Mail Shah asks, may I know in Europe, what is the control on the processor on the mix of the rPET with the virgin PET? What is the method and quality assurance that ensures that a bottle has 25% PET? And I think that you've already answered that, really, that it's for the countries to actually implement the legislation and police it. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, we will have to come up with a implementing decision providing calculation rules for recycled content, which will deal with nitty-gritties like how to deal with cap, adhesive, labels, moisture content, bio-based content, which may or not be recyclable. But amongst others, of course, this implementing decision will as well deal with chain of custody schemes, which basically does not oblige member states to do it exactly that way. But it will put up requirements which may be helpful to ensure that the recycled content on whatever 25% per member state is achieved, actually. So it will point to let's say requirements which such a chain of custody scheme needs to fulfill. Yeah.
Okay, I've just put Chloe Kinner's question through there, which I think you've answered in the few minutes since she posed it. The standard that is needed for imported rPET food grade pellets to be considered compliant. It's the same.
It's the same, exactly. Yeah. Imported are non-different from those produced here. And of course, I know that colleagues from DG Santé together with EFSA are working hard to actually speed up the authorization process via EFSA and the Commission then at the end to get recycling facilities as well approved and authorized to do so. And of course, first for PET and foremost for PET. And then in future steps also for all other polymers if possible.
Okay. Now, Pavlas Lixa says, currently the major part of recycled material from collected PET bottles is used for downcycling. Is the EU considering restricting downcycling to ensure real circularity of PET bottles?
It's difficult for us to get involved in that. I mean, at the end of the day, these are the market forces which will determine where a material goes. I mean, I know that certain companies require food grade materials for bottles for their cosmetics, for example, where you may argue, well, is that really necessary? I would expect if you set a recycled content target for a food contact application and the price of recycled PET, which meets those requirements, goes up, it will be less and less interesting to sell that material for a textile application where this quality is not needed. So probably, assumingly, the market will at some point also not be prepared to pay a higher price for this recycled PET for an application where the quality is just overblown, basically. But this is something which is in the hands of the market, of course.
And that would actually encourage more reuse, recovery and reuse, will it not?
Yes, as well. Yeah. And as well, it's of course a question we are thinking about but that's a different context and years away. In the context of the revision of the Waste Framework Directive, there is a discussion, do we need to specify better what is meant with high quality recycling? Because that is in the directive. I think it's also in the Packaging Waste Directive, if I'm not wrong. But it's not specified to a degree where you could say, well, this counts as high quality recycling and that doesn't count anymore. So that is in the SUP context not the case.
Okay, it may happen in the future, but it's not happening just yet. Okay, Santiago Rothstein asks, what will happen? It's a good question, this, I like it. What will happen once we achieve the recycled target content and the Commission still finds plastic on the beaches? Should we expect to see all plastic packaging forbidden?
Well, I mean, again, the SUP directive is not against plastics. It's against littering of plastics and the unsustainable use of plastics. And you have to look at it, as I mentioned, from both sides. Well, to have plastic litter on the beach, you need to have the plastic product, in most cases, the single-use plastic product in the first place. So we try with the directive actually to move away from these single-use plastic applications where there are sustainable alternatives available. On the other hand, you need to have somebody there who litters the product. So it's not only the product, it's the product and the consumer. And what we try to do with the directive is as well to address the consumers via awareness measures, but as well via, at the end of the day, it will come a little bit via EPR measures as well, extended producer responsibilities, that probably at some point certain products will become more expensive. If you have to pay for litter costs, you will think harder whether you do that. And if you have more awareness campaigns on please do not litter these things which contain plastic in the environment because they have negative impact on the environment, the hope is, of course, that at some point will lead to less litter. If in the review in 2027, we have to concede that actually it didn't work for some reason, we find the same amount of plastic litter, and we will monitor that also in the context of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. There will be an increased monitoring of what is actually littered, at least for the marine environment, less for the terrestrial environment, but for the marine environment. And there we will basically have to see whether we would need to enlarge the scope of the directive and whether we would need to go more for, let's say, pushing towards reusable items than other, let's say, single-use items. So that is in question, which we have to see in the review, which is foreseen for 2027.
Okay. Fiona Palmer asks, when will the SUP product definition guidelines be published? Have they already been published?
I'm laughing because I would be so glad if they are published.
Oh, right,
okay. What I can say is that the inter-service consultation, so the deliberation of different commission services is closed, that we have given it both into the translation and adoption procedure. Unfortunately, we cannot have the adoption before all translations in all official member state languages are available. And that takes at least 20 working days. So my best guess at the moment is it will be between May 20 and May 30. That's what I hope for. But the target, I don't adopt. It's a college, so I don't translate. And we don't want to rush too much translation either, because as I indicated a little bit with the implementing regulation on marking, there were errors which were correct at different places, but in part as well related to the translation and in part even related to the publication. And of course, if you rush things, it's human that more errors happen if you don't rush things. So yes, it will take the time it takes. We are aware of the critical situation that, well, you need the guidelines to be able to see whether your product is covered or not. It's a very unfortunate situation that it is delayed that much. And we have to get it out as soon as possible, but as well without errors.
Okay, well, that doesn't leave much time before the first measures are coming in on July the 21st.
No, that is the 3rd, actually, July 3rd. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, July 3rd, even less time.
Yep.
Good, okay. Now, do you expect any delays or easings of targets as a result of disruptions to the markets because of the pandemic? We've already answered that one. Jose Manuel, there is no English government. There's a United Kingdom government. And the law will not be different in different parts of the United Kingdom. Right, MS implemented recycled content per company or per bottle. Manufacturers that do not comply risk a marketing ban. Yes, I think they possibly do. At the same time, the demand for rPET is exploding because of huge voluntary commitments from several brands. How can we avoid less competitive SMEs, small to medium enterprises, being forced out of the market because they cannot compete for the scarce resource of rPET?
Again, that is one of the points where we are aware that there may be, let's say, negative sides of high prices of rPET, while, of course, in general, the recycling industry, at least in the terms of crisis, crisis and low virgin materials, can be happy that, well, recycled PET actually achieves a high market price, which I think in the first place is a good indication of the value of that material. Of course, if, let's say, the biggies go after the high quality material, then of course smaller companies are in danger of being, let's say, pressed hard to compete on those prices. Again, it is not the Commission actually which can rule that. It is something we have to be aware of. And it is, I don't know, for example, that is really something also for when member states transpose those targets. If you have a member state-wide target, of course, you could think about a, let's say, de minimis threshold. Again, that is not up to us, but the target is not product specific. Again, the target in the directive is for a member state. It does not oblige each product to have this recycled content. But again, it's a question for member states on how they transpose that.
Okay. Interesting point from Joao from Portugal again. Will there be related standards for labels?
There are marking requirements for labels, the ones which I showed on one of the later slides, but they do not relate on recycled content. No. So on recycled content, there is no requirement to label.
Okay. Now, Povilas Lixa asking, if I can stop it moving up and down. The requirement for recycled content is based on boosting the demand for recycling material. However, eventually this will cause increase of import of recycled material from outside the EU, which could be cheaper than local recycled material and may ruin the EU recycling industry. Is the EU considering measures to, is the Commission considering measures to leverage it, ensuring that all local trash is recycled first?
We cannot do that at the moment in the framework we have. So for example, it is correct in principle, it is possible that the recycled content in European beverage bottles put on the European market does not have to come from Europe.
Right.
What, of course, we try again is to look at the whole value chain, that with the target of collection, separate collection for recycling of those bottles which are placed on the European market, we hope to improve the situation and availability and potentially as well the price point of this recycled material, which makes it available in sufficiently high quality and to then hopefully as well a sufficiently low price, if you want, that it is affordable. That does not, I mean, I see the point that it cannot be the objective of the directive to induce huge import flows of recycled plastic from outside. Of course, what we have to deal with as well is a situation that usually much more in the EU is recycled at the end of life today versus what is used as recycled content in the input for the production of the product brought onto the market in the EU. So there is at the moment already a huge gap. Well, we actually recycle more plastic than we use ourselves. And that is one of the areas which has led to the Circular Plastics Alliance, the CPA, with the pledges of 10 million tons in products brought onto the market, because there's an imbalance at the moment already.
Yeah, okay. All right, and Boisa Malbasa is asking, how will EU countries monitor and control recycled content? Bearing in mind that goods are coming in from all over the world, and not all countries have the same legal structure for rPET usage and production. Fair enough. Again, how do we make sure that imported stuff is complying?
Yeah, again, it will be a question for member states how to monitor basically the flows, both actually which go beyond the EU, but also within the EU with other countries, if you have, let's say, an exchange, how to ensure that all the bottles on average, which are then placed on your market, meet the recycled content targets. And we will again provide in our implementing decisions on how to calculate and how to measure, as well points on how to verify. But again, the implementation of that verification will be up to member states.
Okay. Colin Jordan asks, will the pace of food grade approval for recycled material increase or accelerate? It's difficult to meet the targets if it doesn't.
Yes, there are, of course, discussions mainly in DG Santé with EFSA on how to change the underlying FCM regulation to make sure that the authorization process is basically put on solid legal grounds and sped up. I know there are, I don't know, roughly 120 or so ongoing authorization of recycling plants, if I'm not wrong. And I think 99.5% are related to PET. Those authorization process will be speed up for sure. I personally have no concerns that will be an issue still in 2025 for PET. Okay. At the moment, actually, the situation could be a bit more difficult for 2030 for the non-PET fractions, because they are let's put it that way, the way on how to authorize a recycling process may be a little bit more complex, simply due to the fact that polyolefins have a different potential to have hazardous substances migrating from the material into food contact materials, into food, sorry.
Right. We've got a couple of related questions. One from Rosalinda. Do you know anything about how this directive will be applied to the Americas? Well, of course, the short answer is it won't. It's up to the Americans to come up with their own legislation. But if they want to export to the EU, then they have to meet EU standards. Pablo Fiorentini says, do you think other countries outside the EU will follow the European model?
Yes, we see already. I mean, for New Zealand, probably it may be the other way around. They may be ahead. Some other countries may be ahead. But we see that in general, the Single-Use Plastics Directive was seen as one of the, let's say, the big achievements of the previous Commission, actually. And that basically quite a few countries are looking into A, from the environmental point, restrict littering, B, try to let's say, reduce the amount of products which they let on the market, single-use plastic products. And we can imagine, although that is not yet that evident, that also on the recycled content level, that will set basically the pace also for other countries. So we do not think that what we do here in Europe has no impact on a global scale. Yeah.
Absolutely. And to those countries that are bordering the EU, Jose, I expect that the UK will continue to meet EU standards on packaging going into the future. Wouldn't be mandatory DRS in each country? Sorry, Martin, I don't understand what you've asked.
Deposit refund schemes, but it is something which, again, I joined DG Environment just a little bit more than a year ago from the Joint Research Center, so I was not involved in the discussions which led to the directive in the first place. But my understanding from those discussions is that that would not have passed the council, as many member states would have seen that as too prescriptive. So we could not write into the directive a mandatory deposit refund scheme. What we have done is to put the targets for separate collection sufficiently high for member states to have incentives to also look into deposit refund scheme as one option to achieve as a separate collection for recycling targets. But it was not an option, seemingly, to put in a mandatory requirement for deposit refund schemes.
Okay. Rana, how are you fixed for time? Because it's now 3:05.
5 minutes or so, maximum 10. Yeah.
Okay. Isabel says, in that case, this is probably the last significant question, I think, that I've got at the moment. The collection targets set in the Single-Use Plastic Directive might not be sufficient to meet the increasing demand of our PET, including the huge voluntary demand of many big brands. The consequences might be marketing bans for companies with lower margins, can't compete for our PET. Actually, I think you've probably already answered that, so I do apologise for bringing it up again. Is the European Food Standards Agency working on standards for recycling processes that obtain food approval for our PET?
There is an established procedure at the moment which produces, let's be honest, slow results. But of course, who is involved is, DG Santé is responsible for the final authorizations, and they think they do it on what's called an EFSA report. So EFSA is basically looking into the recycling plants, into the processes, produces a report, but the report needs authorization from the Commission so that the recycling plant is authorized under this law. And that is what is basically to be changed now in new regulation that is basically providing a better legal basis for how the process can be run in a more efficient way.
Okay, right. I think Chloe speaks for all of us, Rana, in saying thank you for answering all my questions. It's been a great discussion. I would concur, and thank you very much indeed for your time. You've been very generous with it, and I know that you're very busy. And a quick round of applause on behalf of the whole world.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me, and thanks for the opportunity to provide our view, our opinion, and I hope it helped a little bit in answering some questions.
It has, certainly. Okay, that's great. And for everybody else, thank you. And thank you for attending. Thanks for your questions. Jose Manuel, drop me a line privately if you wish. We'll talk about the United Kingdom. And yes, slides are going to be available and the recording is going to be available, and everybody who's registered and has been in attendance will be notified of them. Thank you all very much. Have a lovely day. Have a great weekend wherever you are. Bye now.
Okay. Thanks. Bye also from my side.